The morning mist hung low over the train tracks that cut through the dense forest. A hush blanketed the world, as if even nature held its breath. The air was cold and damp, every sound echoing oddly through the trees. In the distance, a train whistle pierced the stillness, its cry rising in urgency with each passing second. Not far from the bend in the track, little Tommy, barely 2 years old, stood wobbly on the steel rails. His tiny feet struggled to maintain balance on the slick, cold metal. His cheeks were streaked with tears, and his face was smudged with dirt. The faded blue onesie he wore did little to protect him from the morning chill. He had wandered away from the family's campsite while his mother, Clara, had been busy packing their tent. One moment he had been chasing a butterfly, the next, gone. Now he was lost and alone, the surrounding forest a looming maze of unfamiliar sounds and shapes. The ground beneath Tommy's feet began to tremble. The approaching train's deep, growing rumble sent vibrations rippling through the rails. But Tommy didn't understand. He didn't know what the sound meant. All he knew was fear. His small hands reached out, clutching at the empty, fog-drenched air, hoping for his mother's arms. Then, from the dense fog across the tracks, a shape emerged, large but low to the ground. At first, it was just a shadow, moving slowly, cautiously. But when the train's whistle screamed again, the figure began to move faster, with urgency and precision. It was a dog. Not just any dog, a golden retriever. Her golden fur was matted and damp from the morning dew, her body lean but strong, with signs of a hard life in the wild. She wasn't wearing a collar. Her movements were powerful, yet filled with grace. She didn't charge or bark. Instead, her eyes, soft and expressive, locked onto the trembling toddler standing helpless on the tracks. Behind Tommy, the headlight of the train began cutting through the fog, casting long, terrifying shadows on the rails. The screeching of the metal wheels against the tracks grew louder, deafening. The conductor had spotted the child. Inside the engine, he was pulling the emergency brake with all his strength. But the laws of physics offered no mercy. The train couldn't stop in time. In that frozen moment, the dog, this unkempt, golden ghost of the forest, made her move. With surprising agility, she lunged forward. Her strides were swift but calculated, honed from instinct. Just seconds before the train would have struck the child, the golden retriever reached him. She didn't bark. She didn't panic. Instead, she opened her mouth and gently clamped onto the back of Tommy's onesie, lifting him with the kind of care only a mother could understand. With a powerful twist of her body, she leapt sideways, away from the track. The train thundered past them, so close that the rush of air sent dust and leaves flying. The noise was overwhelming. The ground shook. But Tommy, he was safe. He lay nestled against the retriever's warm chest, his cries muffled by the golden fur he was now buried in. As the last car of the train roared by, the retriever remained still. Her body shielded the child, her breathing steady, calm. Slowly, after the silence returned, she rose and gently set Tommy on the soft forest floor, several feet from the rails. She sniffed him, carefully inspecting for injuries. Her nose hovered near his tiny face, her breath warm and quick. When he stirred and looked up at her, something passed between them, a silent, mutual recognition. And then, something even more remarkable happened. Instead of disappearing into the forest, the retriever lay down beside him. She curled her body around his shivering frame, forming a protective barrier from the cold. Her tail gently swept over his legs as if to say, "You're safe now. I've got you." Back at the campsite, Clara had discovered Tommy was missing. Panic surged through her as she called his name, running in frantic circles through the trees. When she heard the train thunder past in the distance, her heart nearly stopped. That sound, so sudden, so near, filled her with dread. She ran toward the tracks with a primal urgency only a mother could understand. As she neared the edge of the forest, Clara broke through the trees and came to a sudden halt. There, on the far side of the tracks, was her baby. And next to him, resting with an almost regal stillness, was the golden retriever. For a few seconds, Clara couldn't move. Her breath caught. Her brain tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Then, with tears already streaming down her face, she ran across the clearing and scooped Tommy into her arms. His arms wrapped around her neck tightly, his face burying into her shoulder with a soft cry of relief. Clara looked down at the retriever. The dog didn't move, only watched her with eyes so deeply intelligent and calm that Clara felt her fear dissolve into awe. This wasn't just a dog. This was something more. Two mothers, from two different species, had collided in the space of a single moment, and something ancient and powerful had passed between them. The golden retriever slowly stood, her movements careful, non-threatening. She stepped back a few paces, allowing the mother and child their reunion, then sat down again a short distance away. She didn't bark or retreat. She simply waited, her head tilted slightly, watching. Minutes later, voices echoed from deeper in the woods. The search party was approaching, park rangers, campers, and Clara's husband, Michael. Their calls grew louder, more urgent. But the retriever didn't flee. Marcus Chen, the lead park ranger, burst through the trees first, his breath catching when he saw the scene. He was followed by Sarah Williams, his longtime colleague, who gasped aloud and instinctively reached for the tranquilizer rifle slung across her back. "Wait," Marcus said softly, holding up a hand. The sight before them was unlike anything they had ever seen in their years of service. A wild golden retriever, clearly a stray, sitting peacefully beside a toddler and his tearful mother. The emotional weight in the clearing was thick and still. Sarah lowered the rifle slowly. No threat here. Just something extraordinary. The forest clearing fell into a hush again, save for the rustle of wind through the leaves and the soft sobs of Clara holding her son. The golden-furred dog remained where she was, still and calm, her intelligent gaze flicking between the boy and his mother. She didn't move. She didn't whimper or wag her tail. It was as if she knew, instinctively, that something sacred had just happened, and any wrong move might break the spell. The search party began arriving one by one, forming a cautious circle around the scene. They slowed their steps, hushed their voices. No one wanted to startle the dog, who by all appearances had just done something unthinkable. Sarah Williams lowered her tranquilizer rifle completely and stepped closer. "That dog," she whispered. "If she saved him." Marcus nodded, still stunned. And then didn't run. That's the craziest part. Everyone stood in awe, unsure of what to do. You could feel it in the air, a deep, invisible thread of understanding running between the humans and the animal. The golden retriever slowly turned her head toward Clara. Their eyes met. Clara was still cradling Tommy tightly in her arms. Her mind replayed what she'd seen over and over, the retriever lying curled around her child's body, guarding him from the cold, from the world, from death. A mother in every sense, just not in the way anyone expected. Slowly, Clara took a step forward and knelt near the dog. Tommy was quiet now, his head resting against her shoulder, thumb in his mouth, his gaze dreamy and distant like he'd just woken from a long nap. "Thank you," Clara said softly. The dog's ears flicked forward. She didn't back away. "Where did you come from?" Clara murmured, more to herself than anyone else. She reached out a tentative hand, palm open. The retriever sniffed it. Then, in a gentle, graceful motion, she leaned forward and rested her snout lightly against Clara's palm. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it said everything. "She's not wild," Sarah said behind them. "Not really. Look at the way she moves, the way she watches us. She's used to people." "Or used to loving someone," Marcus added. "She may have had a family once." The moment lingered a little longer before the retriever took a step back, turned her head toward the forest, and gazed into the trees. It was time. The silence broke with the sound of a twig snapping deep in the woods. The dog's ears perked up, her body alert but not fearful. She took one last look at Clara and Tommy, dipped her head slightly, a soft, deliberate nod that seemed to shimmer with quiet dignity, and then turned. Without a single bark or glance back, the golden retriever padded slowly into the shadows of the trees and disappeared. Clara sat there, unmoving, tears glistening on her cheeks. She whispered something to Tommy, who blinked sleepily and murmured, "Doggy?" The search party remained still, watching the forest long after the dog was gone. No one dared speak for a few minutes. It was as if they'd witnessed something not meant for ordinary eyes, something sacred, ancient, and utterly beyond explanation. Later that afternoon, as the family reunited and Clara wrapped Tommy in a blanket by the fire, rangers began gathering statements and piecing together the incredible story. The conductor of the train was treated for shock after emergency braking had failed. His hands had been shaking when he described the moment he saw the child on the tracks. He'd expected the worst, but then a golden blur had emerged from the mist, scooped the boy off the rails, and vanished just in time. "That dog saved him," the conductor had said, voice cracking. "I've never seen anything like it." In the days that followed, the story spread. First locally, then regionally, then nationally. News outlets descended on Pine Valley, a small mountain town that had never known such attention. Cameras flashed in the town square. Reporters interviewed the train crew, the rangers, and Clara, who told the story over and over through tears and wonder. But one question always remained unanswered. Who was the dog? Searches were conducted. Flyers made. Golden Retriever Hero posters went up around surrounding towns. Animal shelters were contacted. Vets were alerted. But no one ever came forward to claim her. No one reported a missing dog matching her description. It was as if she had appeared just for that moment, and then melted into legend. The community rallied around Clara and Tommy. The blue onesie Tommy had worn that morning was carefully cleaned and later framed in a shadow box that hung on their living room wall. Every time Clara looked at it, her chest swelled with gratitude, with disbelief, and with something like reverence. But the changes didn't stop with them. Mayor Robert Thompson, initially worried the incident might harm tourism, soon found himself at the center of a shift in public perception. Wildlife policies in Pine Valley were revisited and rewritten with a new sense of urgency and compassion. Park boundaries were adjusted. Animal corridors were created. Signs went up reminding visitors, "Respect all life. You never know who might be watching." Artists from nearby towns arrived to pay tribute. A bronze sculpture was commissioned, a statue of a golden retriever standing proud and alert, facing down a train engine in the distance. A small child sat beside her, one hand on her back. The sculpture was titled The Guardian. It stood right next to the spot where the incident occurred. And in time, something else began to happen, something that caught everyone by surprise. More dogs appeared. Not a flood, not dozens, but here and there, golden retrievers and other dogs with similar fur began showing up around the edges of Pine Valley. None caused trouble. They kept to themselves. Sometimes they were spotted watching hikers from a distance. Sometimes they approached children curiously, then wandered off again. No one could say for sure if they were related to her, the retriever, or if something about her act of heroism had shifted something deeper in the fabric of the forest. One thing was certain, everything had changed. One morning, nearly a year later, Clara and Tommy were walking along the same trail that led to the train tracks. Tommy was now nearly 3. His curls had grown longer, his walk more confident, but he still wore the same curious, wide-eyed expression. As they reached the clearing where it had all happened, Tommy stopped. His little hand tugged at Clara's sleeve. "Mommy," he whispered, pointing into the misty forest. Clara followed his gaze. Standing at the edge of the trees, half shrouded in fog and sunlight, was a golden retriever. But not alone. 2 puppies tumbled at her feet, their fur golden and sleek. They played and wrestled, occasionally nipping at their mother's tail. The retriever stood still watching. Clara's breath caught. Was it her? She couldn't be sure. The distance was too great. But something in her chest, in her soul, told her the answer. Tommy's voice, barely a whisper, said what Clara couldn't bring herself to say aloud. "She remembered me, Mommy. She brought them, so they would know me too." In the weeks after that second encounter at the edge of the forest, Clara found herself unable to think of much else. That moment, seeing the golden retriever standing silently with her 2 pups, lingered in her mind like a dream you don't want to wake from. It hadn't felt like a coincidence. Not even close. Clara couldn't explain it rationally. No one could. But deep in her chest, she believed that it was her. The same dog who had pulled Tommy from the tracks nearly a year ago. And now, somehow, She had returned, not alone, but as a mother herself. Tommy had talked about the puppies constantly since that day. He described them with eerie precision, the spot on one pup's nose, the lighter fur on the other's ears. Clara hadn't even noticed those details, but Tommy had. He said they looked at him like they knew who he was. They listened to her, he explained one night before bed, his small voice filled with a calm certainty. She told them about me. Clara didn't know what to say. All she could do was hold him close and whisper, "I believe you." The story of the retriever continued to spread, gaining traction far beyond Pine Valley. People from all over the country came to visit the bronze statue. Some left flowers. Others left stuffed animals, tiny dog figurines, handwritten notes, and framed photos of their own lost pets. It wasn't just a sculpture anymore. It had become a symbol. A shrine, almost. And then, quite unexpectedly, the scientific community took interest. Dr. Maya Rodriguez, a renowned animal behaviorist from UC Berkeley, had watched the viral videos and read the interviews with growing fascination. She came to Pine Valley to investigate what she called the single most compelling case of cross-species empathy she had ever seen. Initially skeptical, Maya interviewed everyone: park rangers, witnesses, Clara. She reviewed footage from the train's onboard camera and local trail cameras. She spoke to Tommy too, expecting to find nothing more than the charming imagination of a child. But what she encountered was different. Tommy spoke about the retriever with a clarity and emotional intelligence that defied his age. When Maya showed him photographs of various dogs, he correctly identified subtle behavioral differences that even seasoned researchers sometimes missed. "He has a gift," Maya told Clara afterward. "Some kind of intuitive bond. I've never seen anything like it." What started as a simple investigation soon turned into something much bigger. Dr. Rodriguez proposed the establishment of a dedicated wildlife observation center in Pine Valley, focused on studying interspecies communication and emotional behavior. The town council approved the plan almost immediately. Donations poured in from all over the country. Volunteers offered time, equipment, land. The project gained support from major universities and wildlife organizations. And within 6 months, construction had begun. The Mother Retriever Wildlife Sanctuary was born. Its mission was simple but profound: to protect, observe, and learn from animals like the golden dog who had changed everything. The sanctuary's core focus was on studying empathy, cooperation, and intelligence in non-primate species, especially canines. Tommy became an unofficial ambassador of the center. He visited often, sometimes sitting for hours near the observation blinds, sketching what he saw. His drawings were stunningly accurate: birds mid-flight, foxes peeking from the underbrush, deer moving through the trees. But his favorite subject, always, was the retriever. He drew her over and over, usually with her pups beside her. Sometimes he added himself to the picture, standing nearby, smiling. One day, while organizing artwork for a local charity auction, Clara found a new drawing. This one was different. The retriever was sitting beside the bronze statue, the guardian. At her feet were several younger dogs. Around them stood children, human and animal together, all watching her. Above the scene, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words. She wanted them all to know. Clara stared at the drawing for a long time. Later that month, an unexpected discovery added a new layer to the story. During a routine trail maintenance check, park rangers located what appeared to be the remains of an old, collapsed cabin deep in the forest, one that hadn't been on any official maps for decades. Nearby, under a patch of tall grass, they found a rusted collar with a nameplate barely legible through the corrosion. Daisy. A vet confirmed the nameplate had once been engraved with Daisy, therapy dog. There was no microchip left to scan, but further investigation into regional records revealed that a golden retriever named Daisy had gone missing nearly 5 years earlier during a forest outing with a therapy group for children. They never found her. Until now. Everything suddenly clicked. Her gentleness, her calm around people, especially children. Her protective instincts. Daisy hadn't been a wild dog. She had been trained to comfort, to protect, to serve. Something must have happened after she was lost. Injury, isolation, maybe even abandonment. But she had survived, and somehow, something in her had never changed. She had kept her heart. When Clara told Tommy about Daisy's name, his eyes lit up. He whispered it to himself a few times, then said, "That's her. I remember." It was enough. Dr. Rodriguez updated the sanctuary's records. Daisy became more than just a mystery. She became a legacy. The bronze plaque beneath her statue was revised to reflect the discovery. In memory of Daisy, a golden heart that protected us all. But Daisy's story didn't end there. That spring, visitors and researchers noticed something extraordinary happening at the sanctuary. Young golden retrievers, some believed to be Daisy's descendants, began displaying behaviors they had never seen before. They interacted with visitors in unusually gentle, observant ways. One pup, in particular, began sitting near children during educational tours, staying close as if assigned to guard duty. Another was seen leading a limping deer fawn to a shallow stream, where it could rest and drink. These weren't random acts. These were patterns. Repeated behaviors that seemed learned, taught, not just inherited by instinct. Daisy, it seemed, had passed on more than just her genes. She had passed on her way of being. Dr. Rodriguez and her team began tracking the lineages. Through DNA testing, they confirmed that several of the sanctuary's golden retrievers were, in fact, direct descendants of Daisy. And more astonishingly, these dogs continued to behave in similar ways, displaying advanced empathy, decision-making, and even what could only be described as moral awareness. The researchers coined a new term, the Daisy effect, a phenomenon in which one animal's deeply impactful behavior creates a generational ripple through her species, and even through humans. As the months passed, Pine Valley continued to transform, not just in policies or infrastructure, but in spirit. The town had always been surrounded by nature, but now, it seemed to exist in partnership with it. Daisy's story had awakened something in the people, an awareness, a quiet reverence for the lives that had once gone unnoticed in the forest beyond. Schoolchildren began visiting the sanctuary on field trips, where they learned not only about wildlife biology, but about empathy, responsibility, and the interconnectedness of all living beings. At the heart of every tour stood the bronze statue of Daisy. Teachers spoke of her with the same tone they reserved for heroes in history books. Clara, once a corporate lawyer with no ties to nature or conservation, had found a new calling. She left her firm and began working with local and national environmental organizations. Eventually, she helped establish a foundation, the Golden Heart Initiative, which aimed to fund wildlife protection and interspecies communication research worldwide. But her most important role remained the one closest to her heart, being Tommy's mother. Tommy was now 4, and though still just a child, there was something remarkably grounded about him. He had a stillness, a way of listening that made adults pause mid-sentence and reconsider their words. He spent hours each week at the sanctuary, sometimes helping the rangers, other times simply sitting beneath the trees, drawing or whispering to the animals. He never claimed to talk to them, not in the way movies portrayed. He just understood them. And they seemed to understand him. One spring afternoon, Dr. Jessica Chin, daughter of Ranger Marcus Chin and now the lead veterinarian at the sanctuary, invited Clara and Tommy to observe something new. "We've been tracking Daisy's descendants closely," she said as they walked through the quiet forest. "Their behavior is extraordinary. Especially one pup. We think you need to meet him." The pup was about 8 months old, his fur slightly darker than Daisy's but with the same soulful eyes. He was sitting beside the trail, tail gently wagging, watching Tommy as they approached. "He's been choosing to stay near the educational cabins," Jessica whispered. "Especially when the little kids are around. He doesn't bark, doesn't seek attention. He just watches over them." Tommy stopped in front of the pup, knelt, and held out his hand. The pup leaned forward, sniffed it once, then licked his fingers gently. The connection was instant. "His name's Flint," Jessica said. Tommy nodded slowly. "He knows." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Knows what?" "That I knew her," he replied. "That I loved her." Jessica exhaled softly. "We've been seeing this across multiple litters. Not just intelligence, but emotional nuance. Responses to facial expressions, vocal tones. Even protective behaviors toward vulnerable animals, not just their own species. She paused, then added, "We believe Daisy passed on more than DNA. She passed on behavior, intention, empathy." It was a radical idea, but one gaining traction fast. Dr. Rodriguez's research, published in multiple peer-reviewed journals, was now the basis of a new discipline, cross-species emotional transmission. The Daisy effect was no longer anecdotal. It was being observed, measured, and documented across various environments. More sanctuaries began opening around the world, using the Pine Valley model. Each focused on creating environments where animals could teach and learn, across generations and across species. More than just shelters, they became schools, temples of trust. Back in Pine Valley, the sanctuary expanded. Observation domes were added to allow quiet, non-intrusive study. Paths were built to help children like Tommy safely walk among the trees where the golden dogs roamed freely, coexisting with deer, foxes, and even the occasional black bear. And then something truly remarkable occurred. During a guided tour with university researchers, Tommy, now 5, spotted something through the trees. He wandered a few steps off the path and pointed. Standing in a small clearing, barely visible through the ferns, was a weathered golden retriever. But this one looked older, her fur streaked with gray, her movements slow, deliberate. She stood tall, head lifted, eyes calm and familiar. It was her. Daisy. She had returned. The researchers froze, unsure of what to do. Cameras clicked. Notebooks fell silent. Everyone simply watched. Tommy didn't move. He just stared, his hand gently resting on Flint's head as the younger dog sat beside him. The old retriever stepped forward, her body language as composed and confident as it had been years ago when she saved Tommy from the tracks. Then she did something no one could have expected. She walked to the center of the clearing, turned to face the small audience, and lay down. One by one, younger golden retrievers emerged from the woods and sat around her. They formed a loose circle, their eyes on her, body still. The gathering had the quiet dignity of a ceremony. "She's teaching," Tommy whispered. Dr. Rodriguez, who had returned to Pine Valley just days before, stood among the observers, her heart racing. She was witnessing a moment that defied science, logic, and perhaps even language. But it was undeniably real. Daisy lifted her head, emitted a low huffing sound, then looked around at each dog in the circle. Her eyes glowed in the golden sunlight filtering through the trees. The air felt charged, like something ancient was unfolding. "She's telling them what she did," Tommy murmured. "She wants them to remember." Jessica had tears in her eyes. "She's passing it on." Daisy remained in the clearing for nearly an hour, surrounded by her descendants. They didn't bark. They didn't whine. They listened. And when she finally rose and walked back into the forest, they followed in silence, no longer just puppies, but witnesses to something sacred. That evening, Pine Valley's research team recorded a significant spike in coordinated behavior among the sanctuary's dogs. Communication between individuals increased. Protective actions, such as surrounding younger or weaker animals, rose by nearly 40% in a single week. Something had shifted. The clearing where Daisy had gathered her pups, now referred to by the researchers as the Golden Circle, quickly became the most studied location in the sanctuary. Motion-activated cameras were discreetly installed in the surrounding trees, and observation blinds were built at a respectful distance. But nothing that followed could quite match the presence of that quiet afternoon when Daisy had returned to teach. In the days after that event, something remarkable happened. Young golden retrievers began visiting the statue of Daisy more frequently. Not with the random curiosity of dogs exploring new ground, but with a kind of reverence. Some would sit beside it quietly for several minutes. Others brought small objects, sticks, leaves, or even pine cones, laying them at the base of the bronze paws. Visitors began calling them offerings. Scientists hesitated to use such emotionally loaded terms, but even they couldn't deny the patterns. The behavior was not accidental. It was repeated, deliberate, purposeful. It was Tommy, however, who offered the most profound insight. She told them this is where her heart stayed, he explained softly one morning as he sat beside the statue, sketchbook in hand. That it's not just a statue. It's where she remembered being brave. He gently placed a small wildflower at the base of the monument and added, "They come here to be brave too." The scientists observed in stunned silence. Tommy didn't speak like a 5-year-old. He wasn't parroting adult phrases or guessing at behavior. He knew. It was a quiet kind of knowing, the kind that didn't need explaining. That same week, Clara received an invitation to speak at an international wildlife conference in Geneva. They wanted her to present the story of Daisy, from the train tracks to the sanctuary to the growing phenomenon known as the Daisy effect. At first, Clara hesitated. She wasn't a scientist. She wasn't a policymaker. But she was a mother. And Daisy had saved her child. So she went. Clara's speech was simple. She told the story not through data or charts but through moments. She described the train whistle in the fog. The way Daisy had cradled Tommy with her body. The gentle huff she made before disappearing into the forest. And the reunion, when Tommy whispered, "She remembered me." When Clara finished, the hall was silent. Then came a standing ovation. That conference marked a turning point. Policies began shifting globally. Wildlife researchers started integrating emotional behavior into their tracking and documentation. Animal sanctuaries across the world launched companion programs modeled after Pine Valley's system, blending human outreach with emotional intelligence research. But back home, in Pine Valley, life remained tenderly ordinary. Tommy went to school like other children. He played with neighborhood kids, loved spaghetti night, and had a growing fascination with space and stars. But he also continued spending time in the sanctuary, often accompanied by Flint, who had become his constant companion. Wherever Tommy went, Flint followed. Watching. Listening. The two seemed to communicate without speaking. Sometimes Tommy would sit down suddenly mid-walk, and Flint would sit too. Then they'd both look off into the woods, as if waiting for something. Other times, Tommy would laugh quietly and say, "She's proud of us." And Flint would let out a soft huff that sounded almost like agreement. Dr. Rodriguez, still running the scientific division at the sanctuary, began publishing papers detailing what she described as generational emotional transfer. Her findings showed that Daisy's descendants were displaying behaviors not just taught but emotionally contextualized. These weren't merely reflexes, they were values. And that raised a new question: can animals possess values? For many researchers, that was a controversial leap. But for those who had stood in the clearing and witnessed Daisy's circle, it wasn't even a question anymore. The answer was yes. More surprises followed. Several young retrievers began engaging in behavior that mirrored Daisy's rescue of Tommy. In controlled, simulated scenarios, using mannequins representing injured or vulnerable children, these dogs consistently attempted to drag, shield, or protect the dummies. Not all succeeded, but the intention was clear. It was consistent. It was conscious. The data was undeniable. One study documented a young female retriever, believed to be Daisy's great-grandpup, pulling a life-sized mannequin off a set of mock train tracks, then curling around it protectively. What stunned the researchers wasn't just the action, it was what she did afterward. She lay beside the mannequin for over 2 hours, periodically licking the face and making soft, rhythmic huffing sounds. She wasn't trained. No commands. No treats. No reward. She simply knew. And when Tommy saw the footage later, he smiled softly and said, "She remembers the story." More and more, the sanctuary became a pilgrimage site. Parents brought children. Veterans brought service animals. People who had suffered loss came seeking peace. And often, they left with something unexpected, an encounter with one of Daisy's descendants who seemed to see them in a way most people didn't. The sanctuary staff began recording testimonials. "I was sitting alone on the bench crying," one visitor said, "and a golden retriever I'd never seen before came and rested her head in my lap. She didn't move. She just stayed there until I felt like I could breathe again." Another wrote, "I lost my son 5 years ago. I hadn't smiled since. But today, that dog looked into my eyes and licked the tears off my face. I felt something shift. The team began tracking these interactions. And one by one, patterns emerged, matching body language, timing, and behavior cues. A hypothesis was born. Daisy hadn't just saved Tommy's life. She had awakened something ancient and beautiful in her kind. An instinct that was deeper than survival. An instinct to care. And in doing so, she had changed not only the forest, but the world. By the time Tommy turned 6, Pine Valley had become a destination not only for wildlife researchers but for philosophers, poets, and educators from around the globe. What had begun as a miraculous rescue had grown into a living example of something humanity had only ever dreamed of: mutual understanding between species. Daisy's influence had become so vast that international institutions were revisiting old doctrines on animal cognition, expanding the definition of intelligence to include emotional reasoning. Not just how animals think, but how they feel and how they choose to respond to what others feel. The golden retrievers at the sanctuary, especially Daisy's line, were at the center of it all. Their behavior had taken on a sophistication that challenged even the most seasoned skeptics. One young male, Copper, had become especially notable. Like Daisy, he had a calming presence. Unlike typical retrievers who bounded eagerly toward anyone, Copper was selective. He would observe visitors quietly before deciding to approach. Often, he chose people sitting alone, visitors who weren't speaking or taking photos, but simply staring into the woods with heavy expressions. And somehow, Copper always knew who needed him most. He was once seen approaching a soldier who had lost his leg in combat. The man had said nothing for hours, simply sitting beside the statue of Daisy. Copper came, rested his head on the man's stump gently, then pressed his body beside him and stayed there until the sun began to set. That night, the man asked the sanctuary if he could volunteer. "Something in him," he said, "reminded me what it means to feel safe." These weren't isolated incidents. They were happening weekly, sometimes daily. And then, something truly extraordinary happened. Dr. Rodriguez and her team began analyzing vocalizations within Daisy's descendants. Using advanced audio-spectral tools, they detected subtle tonal differences, almost like inflections in human speech. But it wasn't just barking or whining. These dogs were using specific frequencies at distinct moments, before approaching people, when comforting distressed children, or while interacting with each other during training exercises. More than sounds, they were messages. The researchers developed a term for it: contextual resonant vocalization. Not language in the traditional sense, but a patterned method of transmitting emotional states, intentions, and reassurance. In time, AI systems trained on months of recorded data were able to predict what a dog would do next based on these vocal cues, with stunning accuracy. One day, during a live demonstration for the United Nations Environmental Council, a young female retriever named Maple was brought into a room where 3 adults sat behind a glass wall. Each had been asked to maintain a neutral expression. The observers had no idea which one was experiencing genuine distress. Maple walked in, sniffed the air, paused, then went straight to the woman on the right, placing a paw gently in her lap. That woman began crying. She had lost her son in a car accident just 6 weeks before. The room fell silent. The panelists wiped their eyes. And the council passed a resolution on the spot to fund further research into interspecies empathetic communication. Meanwhile, back in Pine Valley, life for Clara and Tommy continued at its own peaceful rhythm. Clara had shifted her work to a national scale, consulting for governments on wildlife legislation and advocating for species protection laws. She helped draft the Coexistence Accord, a multinational agreement to preserve natural habitats and promote ethical interaction with emotionally intelligent animals. Tommy, still young but deeply intuitive, had become something of a global symbol. Documentaries were made about him. His sketches were displayed in galleries. Scientists consulted with him on behavioral interpretation, not for data, but for insight. "You see what we can't," Dr. Chen once told him. "You feel it before it even begins." Tommy would just smile, pet Flint, and say, "They're talking. We just have to stop talking over them." But despite the growing attention, Tommy remained humble. He loved being in the sanctuary most, especially near the small pond where Daisy had once appeared. Sometimes he'd see Flint sitting there alone, tail still, ears forward, eyes fixed on the water. "She visits him sometimes," Tommy would whisper. He listens to her stories now. One early autumn morning, a rare fog rolled through the sanctuary. The staff had become accustomed to odd synchronicities in Pine Valley, but this one felt different. The air was hushed. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Tommy had risen early and gone into the woods with Flint before sunrise. Clara trusted him by now. His sense of where he should be was never wrong. Hours passed. When he returned, his hair damp with dew and cheeks flushed with cold, he carried something wrapped carefully in a bundle of moss and leaves. "It's hers," he said quietly, handing it to Dr. Chen. Inside was a smooth, time-worn collar. The metal tag was weathered beyond recognition, but the feel of it was unmistakable. The loop was cracked, rusted. The leather, stiff with age. But everyone knew what it was. Daisy's original collar. "How?" Clara began, but didn't finish. Tommy simply said, "She wanted me to have it." They framed the collar in a case beside the statue. Beneath it, a new inscription was added. "She remembered us." From then on, a quiet tradition began among the sanctuary's visitors. Each person who experienced something they couldn't explain, a moment of healing, an unspoken connection with a dog, a feeling of clarity after years of confusion, left something near the collar. Not trinkets, not souvenirs, but messages. Notes that simply read, "I see you. I'm listening now. Thank you for finding me. I understand." And in a quiet corner of the sanctuary, just beyond the edge of the pond, a new tree had begun to grow, sprouted, the botanists later confirmed, from a single seed buried beneath the soil where Daisy had once lain down beside Tommy all those years ago. A golden maple. They named it the Tree of Return. Under its branches, children and animals often gathered, and every so often, when the wind moved just right and the sun hit the clearing at a perfect angle, some swore they saw a shimmer of golden fur weaving gently between the light and the mist. Watching, teaching, remembering. Tommy was 9 when something unexpected happened. He began dreaming in sounds, not images. Whispers layered with soft barks, rhythmic huffs, and forest sounds he couldn't always identify. At first, Clara thought it was just the result of his many hours at the sanctuary, surrounded by animals and their calls. But Tommy knew better. "They're not just dreams," he told Dr. Rodriguez one afternoon during a behavioral study session. "They're memories, but not mine." The researchers leaned in, skeptical but respectful. They had long since learned that when Tommy spoke, it paid to listen with open minds. "I can feel what it was like when Daisy ran," he said softly. "When she lifted me off the tracks. The metal shaking. The wind. Her heartbeat. I feel it at night." That night, Dr. Rodriguez and her team pulled every neurological scan they had of Tommy from the past 2 years. Patterns had begun to form, anomalies at first that were now far too consistent to dismiss. During periods when he'd interacted with Daisy's descendants, his brain activity spiked in areas typically dormant during childhood, zones associated with empathy, high-order reasoning, and sensory mapping. Even more astonishing, those spikes matched the patterns seen in retrievers during emotionally charged moments. There was no doubt. Tommy was syncing with them. This phenomenon, soon dubbed resonant empathic mapping, became a new focus of international scientific study. Universities across the world petitioned to collaborate with Pine Valley. New facilities were built, equipped with the latest neuroimaging technology, soundwave analyzers, and behavioral recording suites. But amid the rising academic attention, Clara never let Tommy lose himself in the noise. "You're still a boy," she'd say, brushing his hair back as they lay under the Tree of Return. "And even if the world calls you something else, I'll always be your mom first." Tommy would nod, then smile. "I know, but I think Daisy's still helping me." Clara's eyes would mist. "I think so too." Meanwhile, Daisy's lineage grew stronger with each passing year. Her great-great-grandpups now roamed the sanctuary, each bearing some part of her grace. Some inherited her eyes. Others her poise. A few, like Flint and Maple, showed uncanny emotional awareness, approaching visitors before signs of distress became visible. They seemed to sense what others hadn't yet realized. And in the evenings, when the mist rolled in through the forest, the dogs would sometimes gather under the tree of return. Not to play, not to bark, but to sit quietly as if waiting. One ranger called it the hush, a moment of unified stillness. The dogs would face the same direction, toward the northeast edge of the forest, and just listen. Then, as one, they'd rise and walk deeper into the woods, forming lines like a procession. It happened again and again. At first monthly. Then, as years passed, only during specific events, the anniversary of Daisy's rescue, the blooming of the golden maple tree, or whenever Tommy returned from long trips away. "They're following memory," Tommy once whispered. "They're keeping it alive." Across the globe, the Pine Valley model was now replicated in 31 countries. These sanctuaries didn't just house animals, they taught coexistence. Dogs, wolves, elephants, whales, even parrots, all showed behaviors that hinted at something deeper. Emotional knowledge passed through generations. But none had a story quite like Daisy's. To honor that, the United Nations designated a new global observance, World Interspecies Empathy Day, celebrated each year on the anniversary of Daisy's rescue of Tommy from the train tracks. On the first celebration, Clara was invited to speak. She brought Tommy with her. Standing at the podium, in front of a hall filled with scientists, world leaders, and children, Clara paused before reading her speech. Instead, she looked at Tommy and said, "Would you like to speak?" He nodded. "I don't know how she knew I was in danger," he began, voice soft but steady. "But I know what she felt. Because I feel it too now." He placed his hand gently on Flint's back. "She didn't save me because she was trained. Or because she thought humans were better. She saved me because she cared. That's what we forget sometimes. That animals care." The silence was total. "They speak," he continued. "Not with words, but with what they do. We just have to learn how to hear it." And from the back of the room, someone began to cry. Later that day, global leaders signed the Species Understanding Charter, a groundbreaking agreement aimed at protecting not just animal lives, but their cultures, their emotional networks, their ways of learning. Tommy's name was written on the first page, right beside Daisy's. At home, Pine Valley celebrated in its own quiet way. Children painted portraits of Daisy and tied gold ribbons around the trees. The sanctuary held a dusk ceremony beneath the golden maple. People lit lanterns and sent them floating down the stream, each one carrying a note. Clara's read simply, "Thank you for my son." Tommy's, "I'm still listening." That night, a new pup was born. She had soft fur, pale as moonlight, and one striking patch of gold over her left eye, just like Daisy had. The team named her Hope. Hope grew quickly. And from the very beginning, she exhibited something extraordinary. She would sit beside the tree of return without being taught. She would approach children who didn't speak and simply lay her head in their lap. And at just 6 months old, she began emitting vocalizations that hadn't been recorded in any other golden retriever since Daisy. One huff, in particular, matched the same frequency Daisy used when shielding Tommy from the train. "It's not mimicry," Dr. Chen whispered during a team meeting. "It's memory, passed down in voice." But for Tommy, it was something simpler. "She remembers her," he said one afternoon, watching Hope chase butterflies beneath the golden leaves. "She's part of her. Just like I am." And in that small sanctuary tucked between the mountains and the forest, generations gathered, not just of dogs, but of humans and animals alike, each bound by the invisible thread of care, courage, and connection. The world might have called it science, but to Tommy it was love. Years passed, and the sanctuary continued to thrive. Golden retrievers from Daisy's line were now part of an official interspecies empathy program. They were raised not for obedience but for observation, connection, and emotional resonance. Schools, hospitals, refugee centers, and even juvenile detention programs across the world requested visits, not just for therapy, but to build bridges. Between pain and healing, between silence and hope. Each time, the retrievers chose who to approach. And without fail, They always knew exactly who needed them most. But no dog in the program was quite like Hope. From the time she was a pup, she showed not just emotional intelligence but what many started calling emotional inheritance. She didn't simply act like Daisy, she moved like her, reacted like her, watched people with the same deep, seeing gaze. Tommy, now a teenager, had begun working closely with Hope. He no longer needed explanations or EEGs to read what was happening. He described his connection with Hope as something beyond training, a memory older than me, but living in both of us. On the anniversary of Daisy's rescue, the sanctuary hosted a global symposium. Scientists, ethicists, artists, and children from every continent gathered in Pine Valley. The forest was decorated with white ribbons, each one bearing a child's handprint or a dog's paw print. But it was what happened that evening that no one could explain. As the sun set and a golden haze filled the woods, Hope broke away from the group and began trotting toward the tree of return. Tommy followed, heart pounding. Flint, now older, gray around the muzzle, came too. Hope stopped at the base of the tree and stared into the mist. And then she sat. Not facing the crowd, not looking for praise, but gazing into the forest like she was waiting. Tommy joined her, sitting silently in the fallen leaves. No one said a word. The crowd followed their gaze. And then, in that quiet twilight, a figure emerged. It was a golden retriever, massive, dignified, moving slowly but surely. Her fur was streaked with silver, her gait heavy but graceful. The breath caught in Tommy's throat. It was Daisy. The older retriever paused near the edge of the clearing. Time seemed to fold in on itself. It didn't matter that she should have been long gone. It didn't matter how or why. She was here. Hope rose slowly and walked toward her, then stopped and dipped her head in the exact same way Daisy had all those years ago when she saved Tommy. Daisy stepped forward and returned the gesture. 2 generations. 2 hearts. The same message. Remember me. Carry me forward. Tommy took a step closer but didn't speak. He didn't have to. Daisy looked at him once more, and in that gaze, he saw everything. The train, the fear, the warmth, the miracle. He felt the breath on his cheek, the fur against his back, the huff in his ear. Not as memory, but as presence. And then, as softly as she came, Daisy turned and walked back into the mist. She did not look back. She didn't need to. Hope remained in the clearing a little longer, then returned to Tommy's side and nuzzled his hand. She licked his palm once and sat quietly beside him as the forest lit up with fireflies. That night, Clara sat on the porch with Tommy, both wrapped in blankets, Flint lying at their feet. "She came back for you," Clara whispered. Tommy nodded. "No. She came back for all of us." From that moment forward, everything changed. The sanctuary became a World Heritage Site. Schools began teaching a new subject, cross-species emotional literacy. Governments revised conservation laws to include emotional significance as a measure of species protection. Retrievers like Hope were no longer called therapy dogs. They were given a new title, Bridges. And Tommy? He became a global ambassador, not for wildlife in the traditional sense, but for something deeper. He was called to speak at the United Nations, at NASA, at the World Council for Peace. But he never left Pine Valley for too long. "This is where I heard her heart," he would always say. And just like Daisy had passed her memory to Hope, Tommy began passing his gift to others, not through lectures, but through presence, through listening, through seeing. On his 18th birthday, a final surprise awaited him. Flint, now old and frail, had spent his last months mostly resting. But that morning he stood up, walked to the tree of return, and barked once, just once, into the woods. And then he laid down beneath the roots and closed his eyes. He did not wake again. Tommy buried him beside the tree, next to where Daisy had first waited in the mist. No grave marker, just a smooth, golden stone with a single word carved into it. Faith. Years later, when people asked Tommy to describe what had happened in Pine Valley, how a dog had changed the world, he would simply reply, "She remembered love, and she taught the world how to carry it forward." Today, Daisy's legacy lives on in the sanctuary, in children who sit quietly with dogs and learn to feel again, in animals who show mercy, and in people who finally see them as more than creatures, but as teachers. Not all stories end with applause. Some end with silence, mist, and the soft brush of golden fur against your soul. And if you ever find yourself in Pine Valley, near the old tracks, follow the trail to the tree of return. If you sit long enough, and your heart is open, you might just hear a huff in the wind. And know that you've been seen.